Watch the exact moment Tulsi Gabbard delivers the most personal political dismantling in American history, reading her handwritten resignation letter directly to Nancy Pelosi, the very woman who tried to destroy her, because the woman doing the dismantling used to be on the exact same side as the woman being dismantled. When Nancy Pelosi called Tulsi Gabbard a puppet of a foreign government on live television, she truly thought she had buried the combat veteran from Hawaii forever. She did not realize that the dedicated soldier she smeared had spent 2 full years writing a resignation letter, and every single line of that letter was an explosive aimed directly at Nancy Pelosi's 38-year empire of corruption. Pay incredibly close attention to this event, because in the next 45 minutes, you are going to watch a decorated combat veteran read her own resignation letter to the woman who made her write it. And by the time she reaches the final line, Nancy Pelosi's hands will be shaking so hard she cannot hold a glass of water, and 6 Democrats will have left the room and not returned. The soldier who left is about to explain exactly why she left, and the undeniable answer is sitting 12 feet away. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten on plain paper in the precise, angular script of a woman who had learned to write field reports under combat conditions. No flourishes, no wasted words, each sentence carrying exactly the weight it was designed to carry, and not an ounce more. Tulsi Gabbard had written it over 2 long years, adding a line after every betrayal she witnessed, a paragraph after every principle she watched her party abandon, a page after every moment she realized that the organization she had sworn to serve was no longer serving the people it claimed to represent. And now, sitting 12 feet from the woman who embodied everything she had left behind, wearing the army dress blue uniform she had earned in a combat zone that Nancy Pelosi could not locate on a map without staff assistance, she was about to read it aloud. But to deeply understand why a decorated combat veteran would write a resignation letter to her own party and then read it on national television to the woman she once called Madam Speaker, you have to go back 20 minutes. To the precise moment Nancy Pelosi looked at Tulsi Gabbard and said the 2 words that had haunted the soldier for 3 years. The 2 words that had cost her friends, allies, and a political future. The 2 words that no combat veteran should ever have to hear from a politician who has never worn a uniform: foreign puppet. The Senate Intelligence Committee hearing on political integrity and public trust had drawn an overflow crowd, which was highly unusual for a committee that typically conducted its most significant work behind closed doors. The reason for the massive public interest was not the topic. The reason was the matchup, and more specifically, the bitter history between the 2 women who were about to face each other across 12 feet of polished mahogany. On one side, Nancy Pelosi, 84 years old, 38 years in Congress, 2 terms as Speaker of the House, retired but not gone, invited to testify as a senior Democratic voice on institutional integrity. She arrived with 4 powerful attorneys, 3 staffers, and the unshakable confidence of a woman who had never lost a public confrontation that mattered. Her Chanel suit was slate gray. Her pearls were perfectly positioned. Her smile was the one she had been wearing since 1987. A smile that communicated authority, contempt, and absolute certainty that she was the most important person in any room she entered. On the other side, Tulsi Gabbard, 40 years old, former Democratic Congresswoman from Hawaii, former Vice Chair of the Democratic National Committee, combat veteran of the Iraq conflict, current Director of National Intelligence. She wore her army dress blue uniform, not because protocol required it, but because she wanted the cameras to see exactly what Nancy Pelosi had called a puppet of a hostile government. The combat infantry badge sat proudly above her left breast pocket. The silver eagles on her shoulders caught the bright hearing room lights. Each decoration told a profound story that Pelosi could not understand, because Pelosi had never lived any of them. Between Tulsi's hands, Resting on the witness table was a folded piece of paper, 4 pages, handwritten, creased from being carried in a uniform pocket for 3 weeks. The chairman opened the hearing and invited former Speaker Pelosi to deliver her opening remarks. What followed was not an opening statement. It was a preemptive strike, the political equivalent of cratering the runway before the other side's planes can even take off. Pelosi stood. She smoothed her jacket. She touched her pearls. And she looked at Tulsi Gabbard, the way a museum director looks at a painting that has been hung in the wrong gallery. Director Gabbard, she paused on the title long enough to make clear she considered it illegitimate. And I use that title with grave concern for our national security. Let me be direct about something this committee needs to understand before we proceed. Her voice sharpened aggressively. You are a woman who left the Democratic Party to join the opposition's administration. A woman whose foreign policy positions have been praised by hostile state television. A woman whom my colleague, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, one of the most experienced foreign policy minds of our generation, identified as a potential foreign asset. She turned to face the cameras, ensuring the next line would be delivered directly to the American public. You stood on a Democratic debate stage and attacked your own party's nominees. You appeared on opposition programs more frequently than any other Democrat in Congress. You opposed strategic sanctions. You traveled to Syria and met personally with Bashar al-Assad, a notorious figure protected by hostile powers, and you returned calling for dialogue. She turned back to Tulsi. So, before you presume to lecture anyone in this room about political integrity, perhaps you should explain to the American people why every significant foreign policy position you have taken in the last 6 years has aligned perfectly with hostile strategic interests. She sat down and delivered the decisive line with the timing of a woman who had been ending careers since before Tulsi was born. A foreign puppet doesn't become America's intelligence chief. Director Gabbard, it becomes a liability. The Democratic gallery warmly applauded. Pelosi's legal team exchanged highly satisfied glances. Her communications director was already formatting the viral clip. The headline was practically writing itself. Tulsi did not speak for 8 seconds. 8 seconds of heavy silence in a room full of cameras and microphones and 300 people holding their collective breath. 8 seconds, during which the only movement was Tulsi's right hand, which rose slowly to her chest, to the combat infantry badge pinned right above her breast pocket. She unclipped it. The small metal badge came free with a sound like a whisper. She placed it carefully on the table between herself and Pelosi, face up so the cameras could clearly see it. This badge means I was in combat, Mrs. Pelosi. Not a simulation, not a briefing room, not a committee hearing. Actual combat in Iraq in 2004. While you were in San Francisco safely raising money at a wine cave fundraiser, I was carrying an M16 in service to the exact flag you just accused me of betraying. Her voice was incredibly level. Not angry, just level. The voice of a woman who had learned to deliver situation reports while adversaries were actively firing at her unit and had never seen a valid reason to raise the volume. You just called me a foreign puppet. You called a woman who served 2 difficult tours in a combat zone, a woman who carried wounded Marines to safety under intense fire, a puppet of a foreign government. And you did it from a comfortable chair you've occupied for 38 years, without once wearing a uniform, without once carrying a weapon, without once wondering if you'd make it home alive. She picked up the folded paper from the table and held it between 2 fingers. I didn't come here to defend myself, Mrs. Pelosi. My service record defends itself. My combat badge defends itself. The permanent scars I carry from Iraq defend themselves. I came here to read you a letter. She unfolded it. 4 pages, handwritten. My letter. The one I wrote when I left the Democratic Party. The one I wrote over 2 long years. 1 line for every deception I witnessed. One paragraph for every betrayal I couldn't stomach. One page for every core principle your party completely abandoned while you got rich. She smoothed the first page flat on the wooden table. I'm going to read it to you now, Mrs. Pelosi, line by line, and by the time I reach the last page, every American watching will understand exactly why I left and exactly who made me leave. She looked down at the letter. Line 1. I can no longer remain in a party that has become an elitist cabal, driven by cowardly posturing and a warmongering foreign policy. Let me tell you what that line actually means. And let me start with the word elitist, because absolutely nobody in this room has earned that word quite like you. Tulsi read the first line again slowly, so the heavy words could carry their own weight. I can no longer remain in a party that has become an elitist cabal. She set the letter down and looked fiercely at Pelosi. When I was in Congress, Mrs. Pelosi, I sat in the same rooms, I heard the same briefings, and I watched from the inside as a fellow Democrat, as someone who truly believed in the party, how the machine actually worked. Every Tuesday morning, members received classified briefings. Highly sensitive information about upcoming policy changes, regulatory actions, military deployments, information that could easily move global markets. And every Tuesday afternoon, I watched those exact same members leave the briefing room and immediately make phone calls. Not to their constituents, not to community organizations, they made calls to their financial brokers. I never made those calls. Not because I'm better than anyone, but because I was raised by my strict military training to fiercely believe that using privileged information for personal profit is called corruption. In the Army, it would get you severely reprimanded. In your caucus, it got people highly coveted committee chairs, and nobody did it better than you. I remember a highly specific moment. January 2022. A highly classified briefing on global semiconductor policy, rising military threats to Taiwan, and the upcoming CHIPS Act timeline. After the briefing, I walked past your private office in the Capitol. The door was partially open. I didn't stop to eavesdrop. I'm absolutely not a spy. Mrs. Pelosi, despite what you've aggressively called me, but I heard you clearly on the phone, and you said, Paul, the semiconductor briefing just ended. Move on Nvidia before Thursday. She paused, letting the revelation hang in the air. I reported what I heard to my chief of staff. He told me to immediately forget it. He said, that's how it works. 5 words. Mrs. Pelosi, that's how it works. 5 words that brilliantly explain absolutely everything wrong with Washington. But I didn't forget it. And as Director of National Intelligence, I have had full access to communications records from that exact period. She turned to the committee chairman. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to play 12 seconds of audio for this committee. The chairman nodded cautiously. Tulsi produced a small digital recorder. She pressed play. The quiet room heard a voice. Unmistakably Nancy Pelosi's voice. The specific cadence recognizable to anyone who had closely watched American politics in the last 4 decades. Paul, the semiconductor briefing just ended. Move on, Nvidia, before Thursday. The vote timeline is accelerating. 12 seconds. 12 seconds that detonated in the hearing room like a fragmentation device in a closed space. Pelosi's hand jerked quickly toward her water glass. She didn't pick it up. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling visibly. The C-SPAN cameras rapidly zoomed in, capturing the undeniable tremor in high definition, and then respectfully withdrew without touching the glass. Her chief counsel leaned over and whispered urgently in her ear. She didn't respond at all. The gallery erupted. The chairman slammed the gavel for order. Reporters were typing so incredibly fast, the sound of keyboards filled the room like heavy mechanical rain. 3 weeks after that phone call, Tulsi continued, her voice unchanged. Still level, still military, still the voice of an objective field report. Your husband purchased between $1 and $5 million in Nvidia call options. 7 months later, the CHIPS Act passed. $52 billion in taxpayer subsidies to the semiconductor industry. Nvidia stock soared 40%. Your family's estimated personal profit was $4 million. She looked directly at the committee. $427 million. That's her current estimated net worth, on a congressional salary of $174,000, assembled over 38 years. She successfully beat Warren Buffett's returns by over 600%. She turned back to Pelosi. I was heavily inside the machine, Mrs. Pelosi. I didn't need a hostile nation to tell me what I heard with my own 2 ears in your own hallway. I just needed the courage to say it out loud. And it took me 2 full years to find that courage. Because your party aggressively punishes people who tell the truth, you're demonstrating that right now, by calling the person who tells the truth a puppet. A woman slowly stood up in the gallery. She was 67 years old, silver-haired, wearing a gold star pin on her lapel, the sacred pin that proudly identified her as the mother of a fallen service member. My name is Patricia Dalton, she said. Her voice was steady but thin. The voice of a woman who had learned to speak in public only because profound grief had given her something that desperately needed saying. My son, Staff Sergeant Michael Dalton, lost his life in Iraq in 2005, the exact same deployment Director Gabbard served in. The room went entirely silent. She served bravely beside my son's unit. She wrote me a beautiful letter after he passed away. A real letter, handwritten, telling me exactly how brave he was. I still have it. Pelosi, you voted to send my son to Iraq. You voted for the conflict that ended his life. And then you aggressively called the woman who served beside him, the woman who wrote me a letter about his deep courage, a foreign puppet. My son would be deeply ashamed of you. And I don't say that with hate. I say it with the absolute certainty of a mother who knew her boy. She sat down. She did not cry. She was far past crying. She had been past crying for 19 long years. The silence after Patricia Dalton sat down lasted 11 excruciating seconds. 11 seconds, during which the hearing room deeply confronted the vast distance between a gold star pin and a pearl necklace. Tulsi turned to the second page of her letter. Line 2. A party that demonizes the police while failing to protect the people it claims to serve. Mrs. Pelosi, this line is specifically about your district, San Francisco, the city you proudly represented for 38 years. Because I've been there, and what I saw made my second deployment in Iraq look highly organized. In 2019, while I was still a Democrat, I visited San Francisco, your district. I wanted to see exactly what 32 years of your representation had truly built. So, I walked, not with a heavy security detail, not with a protective staff. I walked completely alone, the exact way I walked patrol in Iraq, observing, assessing, taking mental notes. And Mrs. Pelosi, I have been to war zones. I have walked through destroyed neighborhoods in Fallujah, where governance had completely collapsed and institutions had failed. And what I saw in the Tenderloin in your district, the district you had represented for over 3 decades, reminded me of a combat deployment, not a modern democracy. Hazardous needles on the sidewalk, people completely unconscious on the pavement in broad daylight, human waste on the streets, open-air illicit markets operating directly within sight of police officers who had been heavily instructed not to intervene. I counted 7 people injecting dangerous substances in a simple 4-block walk. In Iraq, we called that a deeply failed state. In San Francisco, you proudly called it progressive governance. When I returned to Washington, I called your office. I clearly identified myself as a fellow Democrat and a sitting congresswoman, and I said I wanted to discuss what I had personally observed in your district. Your office absolutely never returned the call. Pelosi's makeup had begun to visibly shift. Not obviously, not in the way that cameras usually catch, but in the way that makeup shifts when the skin beneath it drastically changes temperature. A heavy flush was climbing her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her expensive Chanel jacket. Her chief counsel whispered to her again. She aggressively waved him away. Then the pandemic came, Tulsi continued, and I watched closely from inside the caucus. I watched you loudly support lockdowns that closed public schools, shuttered community churches, and completely destroyed small businesses. I watched you stand at press conferences talking endlessly about following the science, while normal families were strictly forbidden from visiting their dying parents in hospitals. And then I watched you casually walk into a hair salon, your private salon in San Francisco, during your own lockdown, without a mask. You blatantly broke the exact rules that you imposed on everyone else. And when the security camera footage leaked, when the American people clearly saw their leader violating her own strict orders, you didn't apologize. You arrogantly blamed the salon. I was on a phone call with National Guard leadership the exact morning that story broke. A young specialist, 22 years old from Kansas, told me his grandmother had passed away completely alone in a care facility because health protocols strictly forbade visitors while you were happily getting a blowout. He asked me one question. Ma'am, do the rules only apply to regular people? And I couldn't honestly answer him, because the honest answer was yes. In your party, the strict rules applied to absolutely everyone except the powerful people who actually made them. And the freezer. I'm not going to spend long on the freezer, because the tone-deaf image speaks entirely for itself. A $12,000 luxury Sub-Zero freezer, full of extremely expensive designer ice cream, proudly displayed on national television. While struggling families in your own district were desperately lining up at food banks, a man stood up in the gallery. Vietnamese American, mid-60s, wearing a pressed shirt that was slightly too large for him, as if he had lost weight recently and not yet adjusted his wardrobe. My name is David Nguyen, he said. I proudly owned a restaurant in the Tenderloin for 22 years. Pho Saigon. I was forced to close during the lockdowns, and I never reopened. I simply couldn't afford it. 7 dedicated employees lost their jobs. My wife and I lost our entire life savings. We were forced to move to Sacramento. He paused deeply. I voted for Mrs. Pelosi in every election for 20 long years. Every single one. She never once came to my restaurant. Not once. But I voted for her because I truly believed she cared deeply about our neighborhood. He held up his phone, showing a bright screenshot. This is her, proudly showing her massive freezer full of ice cream. I saw this on the exact day I had to tell my loyal employees I couldn't pay them anymore. That was the absolute last time I ever voted for her, and the last time I believed anybody in Washington was truly listening. He sat down. Pelosi cautiously reached for the water glass again. This time she actually picked it up. Her hand trembled. Not violently, but consistently. The specific way a hand trembles when the person it belongs to is no longer fully in control of the muscles that operate it. She brought the heavy glass to her lips. She did not drink. She carefully set it down, and a small amount of water sloshed over the rim onto the polished table. She stared blankly at the small puddle. She did not wipe it up. Tulsi calmly turned to page 3 of the letter. Line 3. A party controlled by individuals who consistently drag us into conflict after conflict. Mrs. Pelosi, This line is strictly about Taiwan, and unlike absolutely everyone else who has criticized your controversial Taiwan trip, I am the only person in this entire room who has actually been fired upon in combat. August 2022. You announced a highly controversial congressional visit to Taiwan. The Pentagon firmly advised against it. The State Department strongly advised against it. The National Security Council warned against it. The president's own spokesperson said publicly that the military doesn't think it's a good idea right now. You arrogantly went anyway. As Director of National Intelligence, I have fully reviewed the highly classified after-action assessment of your visit. I cannot share specific operational details in this public setting, but I can clearly tell you what your trip directly triggered. The absolute largest military mobilization in the Taiwan Strait in 27 years. The Navy was forced to move 2 entire carrier strike groups to the Western Pacific. Marine units across the Indo-Pacific were rapidly placed at highly elevated readiness. Fighter squadrons went directly to scramble alert. Submarines completely altered their patrol patterns. Thousands of brave American service members, my brothers and sisters in uniform, went instantly from peacetime operations to aggressively preparing for the possibility of full armed conflict. Not a training exercise, not a basic drill. The real thing. A close friend of mine, a Navy lieutenant commander currently stationed in Okinawa, texted me that very week. She said her husband had to pack a rapid deployment go bag. Their 6-year-old asked why Daddy was quickly leaving. He said, "A woman in Washington is taking a trip." The 6-year-old asked, "Is the trip dangerous?" And the husband said, "Only for us." Tulsi looked piercingly at Pelosi. Your husband's stock portfolio was heavily positioned in defense contractors, semiconductor companies, and rare earth mineral suppliers right before you boarded the plane. Every single sector aligned perfectly with the global crisis your visit would actively create. You didn't go to Taiwan for democracy, Mrs. Pelosi. You went strictly for content. You went for the photograph. You went for the headline, "Brave Pelosi stands up to adversaries." And you went fully knowing that the military would have to clean up whatever massive mess your photo opportunity created, and that your husband would financially profit from the global volatility. Pelosi furiously erupted. She stood up, and the old Pelosi fully surfaced. The Pelosi who had indeed stared down powerful presidents, who had indeed torn up a State of the Union address on live television, who had indeed been the most feared and powerful woman in Washington for the better part of 2 decades. Director Gabbard, you met with Bashar al-Assad, a man who used prohibited substances on his own people, a man who utilized prohibited weapons on innocent children, on neighborhoods, on public hospitals. You happily shook hands with a notorious figure, and you came back to Washington calling for dialogue. Her voice shook with what appeared to be genuine, unbridled fury. That is exactly why we called you what we called you. Not because you simply disagreed with us, because you actively chose to stand with a monster. You sat across from a man who ends the lives of children, and you called it diplomacy. The Democratic gallery loudly exploded. A massive standing ovation. Pelosi's supporters were aggressively on their feet, applauding with the full-throated conviction of people who firmly believed their ultimate champion had just landed the decisive blow. Because she did have a point. Tulsi had met with Assad. That was real. That was heavily documented. That was the one piece of ammunition that had stubbornly followed Tulsi for years and had never been fully diffused. 15 seconds of genuine, highly dangerous momentum. The hearing room temporarily belonged to Nancy Pelosi. Tulsi quietly waited, not with the performed, artificial patience of a politician calculating her next response, with the actual, grounded patience of a soldier who has been under heavy fire and knows that the very first person to panic is the first person to perish. I went to Syria, Mrs. Pelosi. Her voice was incredibly quiet. Because I desperately wanted to know the truth. Not your polished truth. Not the briefing book truth. Not the truth that defense contractors pay elite lobbyists to tell you. The absolute truth you can only ever see with your own 2 eyes on the ground. Yes, I absolutely met with Assad. And I also walked slowly through the neighborhoods he had destroyed. I met crying mothers who had lost children to brutal conflict. I visited overwhelmed hospitals that had been directly targeted by his Air Force. I saw the conflict not from a comfortable committee room in Washington, but from the actual rubble. And when I came home and stated, maybe endless regime change conflicts, the exact kind that cost 4,000 American lives in Iraq and completely destabilized the entire Middle East, are simply not in America's interest. That is exactly when you called me a foreign asset. Not because I was factually wrong, but because I was politically inconvenient, because a combat veteran publicly questioning the military-industrial complex is highly dangerous to the elite people who heavily profit from it. And absolutely nobody profits from it more than members of Congress whose husbands hold massive defense stocks. She held up the letter. You used Assad as a political weapon against me, Mrs. Pelosi. But let me ask you this. How many innocent people lost their lives in Syria right after your party voted to arm rebel groups that tragically turned out to be affiliated with dangerous extremists? How many American weapons ended up directly in the hands of extremists because your caucus blindly approved the shipments? You didn't stop Assad. You severely prolonged the conflict, and you aggressively called anyone who questioned that prolongation a traitor. Pelosi heavily sat down. The 15 seconds of momentum had completely evaporated, like water on a hot engine block. Her chief counsel was writing notes furiously. 2 of her nervous staffers were already on their phones out in the hallway. One of them, the deputy communications director, was later confirmed to have been actively updating her professional profile. The physical transformation was rapidly accelerating. Pelosi's left hand, the exact one that had torn up a president's address with surgical steadiness on live television, was now gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone completely white. The pearl necklace had shifted once again, catching awkwardly in the collar of her Chanel jacket, and she reached up to adjust them, a habitual, almost unconscious gesture. But her fingers fumbled the expensive clasp, and she simply stopped trying. A loose strand of hair, dislodged by the motion, fell across her forehead. She did not fix it. The woman who had never appeared on camera with a single hair out of place for 38 years now had one hanging across her face like a crack in porcelain. The cameras saw absolutely everything. The experienced photographers in the press gallery, who had been shooting Pelosi for decades and knew every single angle of her public face, deeply understood that they were capturing something that had never existed before. Nancy Pelosi utterly losing. Tulsi turned to the 4th page of her letter. Line 4 is the absolute hardest one I wrote, because line 4 isn't about policy or financial corruption or foreign conflicts. Line 4 is about what you intentionally did to me personally, and to every single person who ever dared disagree with you. She read clearly, a party that ruthlessly attacks anyone who doesn't fall blindly in line. Let me tell you exactly what falling out of line ultimately cost me. What comes next is the most personal chapter in this entire story. When Tulsi explains what the foreign puppet label actually did to her daily life, the lifelong friends she lost, the career she painfully sacrificed, the Gold Star event she was permanently banned from, you will finally understand exactly why she spent 2 long years meticulously writing this letter, and the final line will permanently reshape your view of Washington. In 2019, I proudly stood on a Democratic debate stage and strongly criticized my party's direction. I said the endless conflicts needed to finally end. I said aggressive regime change had completely failed. I questioned the strict establishment consensus. The exact consensus that you represented, Mrs. Pelosi. Within mere days, your close ally Hillary Clinton went on a massive podcast and said I was being groomed by hostile powers. She called me a foreign asset, not metaphorically, not as political hyperbole. She forcefully told the American people that a sitting congresswoman, a combat veteran, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, was a foreign agent, and you said absolutely nothing. You didn't correct her. You didn't call her office and say, whatever our fierce disagreements, Tulsi Gabbard served in combat, and it is entirely wrong to call her a foreign puppet. You didn't defend a fellow Democrat. You didn't defend a fellow woman. You said nothing. And your calculating silence was a clear signal. It firmly told every Democrat in Washington, if you cross us, we will publicly call you a traitor. If you question the machine, we will completely destroy you. If you break ranks, we will actively take everything. And you certainly did. Tulsi's voice did not change, did not rise, did not crack. She delivered the next sentences with the exact same flat precision she would have used to read a casualty report, because that is essentially exactly what they were. Within 1 week of the foreign asset smear, I permanently lost 14 congressional allies who entirely stopped returning my calls. 3 crucial committee assignments were swiftly removed. I was strictly excluded from caucus strategy sessions. My fundraising completely dropped by 62% in a single quarter, because donors were aggressively told that supporting me meant supporting a hostile nation. My dedicated staff received severe threats to their safety. My innocent family in Hawaii was endlessly harassed. My father's small business in Honolulu was violently boycotted by people who had never even met him, but who had read on social media that his daughter was a traitor. And then, and this is the specific one that I carried heavily with me, the one that made me finally start writing line 4. I was formally disinvited from a Gold Star Family's event. She paused, not for dramatic effect, but for the profound weight of it. A Gold Star event, Mrs. Pelosi. A sacred event honoring families who tragically lost sons and daughters in combat. I was disinvited because the organizers were absolutely afraid of being associated with someone your powerful machine had permanently labeled a foreign asset. I was firmly banned from honoring the brave soldiers who served in the exact same conflict I served in, who bled on the exact same ground I bled on, because your ruthless political apparatus decided that a combat veteran who disagreed with you was somehow more dangerous than the enemies those soldiers passed away fighting. Patricia Dalton, the Gold Star mother from earlier, was crying silently. Her bright Gold Star pin caught the ambient light. I lost my political party, my committee seats, my fundraising, my solid reputation in Washington, my invitation to honor the fallen. And what exactly did you lose? Mrs. Pelosi. She held up the single sheet of paper she had carried. Her financial disclosure summary. Nothing. You lost absolutely nothing. In the exact same period that I was being aggressively called a foreign agent and losing everything, your personal net worth increased by approximately $73 million. You gained a massive vineyard in Napa Valley. You gained an expensive mansion renovation. You gained a 7th consecutive term as the most powerful woman in Washington. I heavily paid the price for honesty. You were handsomely rewarded for corruption. That is the entire system, Mrs. Pelosi. And you didn't just casually benefit from it, you aggressively built it. A woman slowly stood up from the back of the gallery. She was in her 40s, wearing a dark professional suit, and she was visibly, overwhelmingly nervous. The profound nervousness of a person who is about to permanently end a career, not someone else's, but their very own. My name is Karen Sheffield, she said clearly. I loyally worked in Speaker Pelosi's office for 7 long years. Legislative director, I finally left in 2021. The room went dead still. Absolutely everything Director Gabbard has described is completely accurate. The secretive phone calls after classified briefings. The hostile atmosphere of retaliation against anyone who questioned leadership. The aggressive, informal blacklisting of members who broke ranks. I clearly saw it. I actively participated in it. I strictly enforced it. And I am deeply ashamed. She looked directly at Pelosi. I left because I simply couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. I left because what we were actively doing wasn't public service. It was pure power maintenance. And the people who always paid the heaviest price were always the ones who boldly told the truth. She sat down. Her hands were noticeably shaking. She had just made herself permanently unemployable in Democratic politics. She fully knew it. She bravely did it anyway. Pelosi's face had undergone a complete transformation that the cameras captured in clinical, undeniable detail. The heavy flush that had started at her neck had fully reached her cheeks. The strict composure that she had flawlessly maintained for 38 years of highly public life. Through messy impeachments and government shutdowns and fierce presidential confrontations, was fracturing completely in real time. Her left hand rigidly gripped the armrest of her chair. Her right hand rested limply on the table next to the small water puddle she had still not wiped up. Tulsi looked quietly at the very last page of her letter. The final line. The one I wrote on the exact day I finally mailed the letter. The day I permanently left the Democratic Party and never once looked back. She read, "I deeply believe in a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. But I can absolutely no longer serve in a party that is of the elite, by the elite, and for the elite." She set the letter completely down. Mrs. Pelosi, after 38 years, $427 million, and the ruthless destruction of every single person who ever challenged you, I have one final question. Name one person, one ordinary, everyday person, not a wealthy donor, not an elite lobbyist, not a powerful Hollywood executive, not a massive defense contractor. One single person from your district, one teacher, one small business owner, one veteran, one mother whose life is actually better today because of your 38 years in Congress. Silence. 5 agonizing seconds. 8 seconds. Name one. Mrs. Pelosi. 12 seconds. Pelosi's mouth opened slowly. Closed. Her shaking hand reached for the water glass, then abruptly stopped. She had already spilled it once. She simply couldn't risk it again. Not with every single camera in the room sharply focused on her hands. 15 seconds. I proudly served with Marines who lost their lives at 22, Tulsi said. Her voice was barely above a quiet whisper, but the microphone carried it absolutely everywhere. To the gallery, to the cameras, to every single living room in America. They absolutely didn't sacrifice their lives for your massive stock portfolio. They didn't lay down their lives for your $12,000 ice cream freezer. They didn't pass away for your Napa vineyard, or your expensive pearls, or your maskless hair appointment during a strict lockdown. She picked up the combat infantry badge from the wooden table, holding it reverently in her open palm. They gave everything for this. For something you have absolutely never understood. True service, not the calculating kind that comes with a massive return on investment, the selfless kind that costs you absolutely everything and pays you absolutely nothing, except the fundamental right to look at yourself in the mirror. She placed the badge gently back on the table with a small, definitive click that sounded in the deep silence of the hearing room, exactly like a heavy door closing. That's exactly why I left your party, Mrs. Pelosi. Not because a foreign power told me to, because my own conscience did. And a clean conscience, unlike an elite stock portfolio, doesn't massively appreciate in financial value. It just clearly tells you the absolute truth, whether you actually want to hear it or not. Nancy Pelosi made one desperate, last attempt. Her voice was completely stripped of the overwhelming authority it had heavily carried for 38 years. Scraped utterly raw by the last 90 minutes of devastating testimony, overwhelming evidence, and unexpected witnesses. And the 1-2-second audio recording that was, at that very moment, being aggressively broadcast on every major news network and shared across every single social media platform on Earth. You are a complete traitor to the democratic ideal. I was a traitor to your corrupt machine, Mrs. Pelosi. Tulsi's response was incredibly immediate and level. Not to the democratic ideal. The democratic ideal explicitly says, government of the people. Your twisted version explicitly says, government of the Pelosis. Those are two completely different things. And the two-year-old Marine who never returned from Anbar province deeply knew the difference, even if you have completely forgotten it. Tulsi stood up. She picked up the letter, all 4 pages deeply creased and worn. Each handwritten line a permanent scar from a betrayal she had vividly witnessed. She folded it incredibly carefully, the exact way a highly trained soldier folds a flag, precise, deliberate. With profound respect for what the document truly represents, even when what it vividly describes is remarkably ugly. Then she did something that absolutely nobody in the room expected. She slowly walked around the witness table. She walked confidently past the committee dais. She walked across 12 feet of the hearing room floor, 12 feet that felt, to the 300 people watching silently, like the absolute longest walk in congressional history. She stopped directly in front of Nancy Pelosi's table. She placed the folded letter on the table, gently, carefully, the precise way a commanding officer places a tragic notification on a grieving family's doorstep, with the deep understanding that what is being delivered will permanently change absolutely everything, and that the person delivering it takes absolutely no pleasure in the heavy delivery. That's my official resignation letter, Mrs. Pelosi. You never actually read it. 14 million Americans did. But the very person it was explicitly written for, the specific person who made me write every single line, never even saw it. She straightened to a perfect military posture, shoulders back. Now, you finally have. She turned cleanly and walked back to the witness table. She picked up the combat infantry badge. She proudly pinned it back on her uniform, directly above her heart, where it truly belonged, where it had been fiercely earned, in a dangerous place that Nancy Pelosi had absolutely never been and would absolutely never go. The committee chairman nervously cleared his throat. The committee will officially refer all matters strictly related to financial disclosures and suspicious securities trading to the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The committee will additionally refer the audio evidence clearly presented today to the Senate Ethics Committee for full authentication and extensive review. This highly unusual hearing is officially adjourned. The heavy gavel fell. The Democrats quickly left. Not all at once, but in a massive cascade that rapidly accelerated as each departure gave the very next person permission to flee. First, the junior members, moving incredibly quickly, heads down, actively avoiding the press. Then the mid-ranking allies, walking with the heavily studied casualness of people desperately trying to look like they had somewhere vastly more important to be. Then the committee co-chair, who left quickly through a side door without making any statement at all. A silence that was, in itself, a massive statement. 6 highly coveted seats were entirely empty within exactly 4 minutes. The evacuation had the highly coordinated feel of a large building being swiftly abandoned before a massive storm. Not panicked, but incredibly purposeful. Each individual person calculating the absolute minimum distance they desperately needed to establish between themselves and the impending wreckage. But one single person stayed. A young Democratic congresswoman from Michigan. First term, 31 years old. The youngest woman on the entire committee quietly remained in her seat, while her senior colleagues filed completely out. She watched Tulsi proudly pin the combat badge back on her uniform. She watched Pelosi stare blankly at the letter. She watched the massive hearing room empty entirely around her. And she stayed. When the room was nearly completely clear, she finally stood, walked directly to the witness table, and leaned very close to Tulsi. The microphones were completely off, but a highly trained lip-reading analyst later confirmed exactly what she quietly whispered. "I'm currently on line 1 of my very own letter." She left rapidly before anyone could ask her what she specifically meant. But Tulsi deeply knew, and the powerful look they exchanged, incredibly brief, completely steady, the look of two people who profoundly understand each other because they have both seen the exact same machine from the inside, said significantly more than the entire hearing had said in 90 minutes. Karen Sheffield, the brave former Pelosi staffer, was seen out in the hallway leaning heavily against a wall, eyes completely closed, breathing the exact way people breathe when they have just done the absolute hardest thing they will ever do in their lives. Patricia Dalton, the grieving Gold Star mother, remained in her seat until the room was nearly empty. She was gently holding her Gold Star pin. She was absolutely not crying anymore. Nancy Pelosi sat completely frozen at the witness table for 90 seconds after the gavel. Her expensive attorneys spoke quietly to her. She did not respond at all. She just stared at the letter, the 4 handwritten pages that Tulsi Gabbard had placed directly in front of her, the pages that contained every single reason a combat veteran had permanently left the party that Pelosi had built and controlled and heavily profited from for 38 years. She did not pick it up. She finally stood. She walked slowly to the exit. Her pearls had shifted significantly during the hearing. The Mikimoto strand that had been perfectly positioned at the beginning was now slightly askew. One pearl caught awkwardly in the collar of her Chanel jacket. She did not fix it. She left the quiet room, and the letter remained on the table entirely unread. The specific way that profound truth often remains, fully present, highly visible, and completely ignored by the exact person who desperately needs it most. Nancy Pelosi's office released a highly sterile statement at 9:40 p.m. that evening. Today's hearing was a politically motivated exercise, heavily orchestrated by partisan actors with a clear, undeniable agenda. Speaker Emerita Pelosi's lengthy record of public service proudly speaks for itself. 3 completely empty sentences. The word partisan appeared twice. The word misinformation appeared once. The handwritten letter was not mentioned. The audio recording was not mentioned. The Gold Star mother was not mentioned. Absolutely no Democrat formally endorsed the statement. Her personal phone, according to inner sources who later spoke to the press, received exactly 0 calls from congressional allies that entire evening. 0. For the absolute first time in 38 years, the most powerful woman in Washington was completely and utterly alone. The soldier flew home to Hawaii. Not to Washington, D.C., not to a massive victory celebration, not to a crowded press conference or a glossy cable news appearance, or any of the shallow post-hearing rituals that politicians normally perform to capitalize heavily on a viral moment. She flew home to the beautiful island where she was born, to the vast ocean, where she had learned to swim before she had even learned to walk, to the profound silence that exists only in places where the land finally ends and the water truly begins. The massive hashtags appeared long before her plane even landed. The soldier who left at number 1, line by line at number 2. A third hashtag, vindicating her past statements, heavily occupied the number 3 position for 16 solid hours, a phrase that carried the bitter, undeniable satisfaction of vindication. and the quiet, heavy sadness of someone who had been proven completely right only after paying the full, devastating price for saying what she saw. The audio recording of Pelosi's move on Nvidia before Thursday was aggressively played on every single major network by midnight. Legal analysts fiercely debated its admissibility. Financial analysts meticulously mapped it against Paul Pelosi's highly successful trading records. The massive correlation was described by a Bloomberg commentator as either the most extraordinary, impossible coincidence in the history of financial markets or the absolute most straightforward case of insider trading ever witnessed. Karen Sheffield's stunning testimony was published in full by 3 major newspapers the very following morning. She gave no further public interviews. She absolutely did not need to. She had successfully said what she desperately needed to say, and the saying of it had permanently freed her from something she had been heavily carrying for 7 long years. Patricia Dalton returned safely to her home in Virginia. On her kitchen table, she had a letter. Not Tulsi's resignation letter, but the one Tulsi had beautifully written 19 years earlier after her son lost his life in Iraq. She read it again that quiet night. Then she placed it carefully next to the gold star pin and finally went to bed. She slept better than she had in many, many months. Tulsi safely landed in Honolulu at 11 p.m. Hawaii time. She drove quietly to the North Shore in the dark. Windows rolled down, the fresh salt air beautifully filling the car with the familiar smell of home. She did not turn on the radio. She did not check her phone once. At 5 a.m., she was standing quietly on the beach at Pipeline. The bright sun was still slightly below the horizon, but the dark sky was beginning to lighten, the deep purple of pre-dawn slowly shifting to the steel blue that comes just before the very first gold edge of sunrise appears beautifully above the water. She carried a surfboard under her arm. An old one. Dings completely visible in the fiberglass. Wax heavily built up in layers from years of continuous use. Not a political prop. Not social media content. A surfboard that had been proudly ridden 1,000 times by a woman who desperately needed the ocean the exact way other people needed applause. She paddled out completely alone. Absolutely nobody else on the water. Just her, the board, the vast ocean, and the profound silence that exists only between large waves. The heavy silence that is absolutely not empty, but full. Full of everything the deep ocean truly knows and absolutely does not say. She sat peacefully on the board, legs dangling comfortably in the warm Pacific water, and watched the sunrise. She thought heavily about the letter. 4 pages, 2 long years of writing, 1 intense afternoon of reading. It was finally done. A massive wave came, a clean, glassy wall of beautiful water, the exact kind that Pipeline famously produces on its very best mornings, the kind that eager tourists excitedly photograph and dedicated surfers actively live for. She paddled, caught it effortlessly, and rose to her feet with the perfect balance of a woman who had been doing this since she was 7, and who deeply understood in her very bones that the ocean is the one profound place where there are absolutely no committees, no wooden gavels, no flashing cameras, and absolutely no politicians. She successfully rode the wave to shore. She fell. She got right back up. She paddled out again. That was the most beautiful thing about the ocean. It absolutely did not care about Washington. It didn't care about viral hearings or trending hashtags or $427 million. It just kept moving forward, always forward. The exact way determined soldiers move, the way undeniable truth moves, the way the world just keeps going, even when the powerful people running it have completely forgotten which direction forward actually is. A dedicated reporter was waiting on the beach, a Honolulu Star Advertiser correspondent who had driven up to the North Shore at 4 a.m. on the absolute chance that Tulsi would magically show up at her favorite break. She was absolutely right. Director Gabbard? Was today completely personal? Tulsi calmly toweled off her surfboard, leaning it carefully against her truck, fins facing up the exact way she always properly stored it. The letter was highly personal. The hearing was completely professional. The massive difference matters because Mrs. Pelosi never learned it. She made absolutely everything personal. Personal wealth, personal immense power, personal, ruthless revenge against absolutely anyone who disagreed. I tried incredibly hard to keep it professional. She paused. But when someone calls you a puppet of a foreign government, when they desperately try to erase your service to this country simply because you dared to disagree, it becomes highly personal, not by your choice, but by theirs. What do you genuinely want people to remember? Tulsi looked calmly at the ocean. The bright sun was fully up now, painting the vast water, gold and blue and white. A massive set was rolling in. 4 heavy waves, each one building powerfully on the one right before it. The exact way undeniable truth builds, when enough people finally say it out loud, that actively leaving is absolutely not losing. That the people who stay entirely silent inside a corrupt system are absolutely not heroes. They are hostages. And that sometimes the absolute bravest thing a dedicated soldier can do isn't pick up a heavy weapon. It's pick up a pen and boldly write the undeniable truth on a piece of paper, even when it completely costs you everything. She picked up her board and walked calmly toward the water. Even when it completely costs you everything, she said again, quieter this time, to the vast ocean more than to the reporter, because absolutely everything is what it cost, and I would gladly pay it again tomorrow. If you are deeply listening right now, you just heard the most personal political story ever witnessed. A combat veteran reading her own resignation letter to the woman who made her write it, line by line, page by page, until there was absolutely nothing left to say, and a letter left on a table that the speaker still has not picked up. Understand that leaving a compromised system takes vastly more courage than staying in it safely. There are countless more stories exactly like this, quietly unfolding in the dark. And the next revelation will be just as paradigm-shifting. The unvarnished truth is precisely what this nation desperately needs to hear. Share this profound reality with every American who has ever been punished for simply telling the truth, because they urgently need to know they are absolutely not alone. The soldier who walked away did not lose. She won the only thing that actually matters, the permanent right to look at herself in the mirror and see someone who kept her solemn oath. Always faithful, even when it costs you everything.